started here. We appreciate you guys joining us. This is a hardware as a service roundtable. There's a lot of discussion happening in the federal government for hardware as a service. And with us today, we have via phone, we have Adnan Shaban. He's the Vice President of Dynamic Computer Corporation out in Michigan. Say hey, Adnan.
Hey, Adnan, I guess.
Awesome. And the other person that you see here, well, Adnan, his camera's not working properly, so he's going to be joining us by phone. And Keith Hasty is the Vice President of Keystone Advisors out of Chicago. Say hello, Keith.
Hello, Keith.
Awesome. And I'm Dave Lowe. I'm a special advisor with Dynamic with Q-wrx, and that's what we're going to be talking about today specifically. And we appreciate all the folks that have signed up and are joining us today all over the place in the federal space. And if we missed your agency, we apologize, but we want to make sure that we know that we very much appreciate you being here as we discuss hardware as a service and specifically desktop deployment, desktop ready deployment, and we'll talk about that. So real quick disclaimer, you can read this. It essentially says that you guys are joining us voluntarily. We're not affiliated with any government agency, and that this is not a commitment to buy from us or anybody else who happens to be here joining us on this roundtable session. Real quick, some of the controls. If you would like to ask questions, you can. You can open up that panel, and you can open up the right-hand side, and you can enter those in and send those to us, or you can raise your hand and let us know you'd like to dialogue with us. And if you would like to dialogue with us and you called in on the phone, make sure you enter your audio pin because we can't unmute you if you don't. And along the way, if you would like to shoot us an email, you can do that as well at govsupport@dcc-online.com. And you can also do it to dccit.com because both of those work. But we want to make sure that you have access to us throughout the whole entire presentation. And if you like the way that Keith and I look, since you can't see Adnan, he's in a fancy suit though, I'm certain. You can drag us and make us bigger, or you can make us disappear altogether. So we'll be talking a little bit today about the current situation that's happening in the federal space, some of the initiatives in the memoranda that you see that are coming through the pipe regarding a refresh of IT equipment and how HaaS, hardware as a service, is being put into that discussion. And we'll talk about that here. Ideally, we're going to get into some lifecycle management issues, which kind of plays into the reason why the federal government is looking at hardware as a service as a viable option, and deal with some questions and answers if you have any, and a pilot program that we are presenting that you may be interested in that we're looking at with the CIO Council and CIOs throughout the federal space. So the question we have here is, my agency has experience with hardware as a service models, and there's only a couple of polls today, so I'm not going to wear you out with these, but we'd certainly love to know whether you have experience with hardware as a service as a model or not, or maybe you're not sure. So you can let us know, and we'll make sure that we address the specific issues for you. Well, that's it. We have 100% voting, and look at the results of this. There's 20% say they have, 40% said no, and 60% aren't sure if they've actually seen it. So we'll talk about specifically about what hardware as a service is. So before we get into that, let's talk about Dynamic Computer Corporation and what you do up in Farmington Hills, Michigan, Adnan, if you're still there, via phone, dressed in a nice suit that we can't see.
I am.
So tell us about.
So Dynamic Computer is an IT service provider. We've been around for 24 years in this exact space. Been around since 1979 as a corporation. And we specialize in delivering IT lifecycle management services to endpoints and other IT devices and hardware. And we act as really an extension of an agency's internal processes, where we take up everything from a complete lifecycle management of acquisition, and we use only authorized parts. I mean, there's detail around all this. Technical services, which is imaging, and any, if we have to build things for devices, We do complete audit proofing. We do audit reporting. We're ISO 9001 and 1345, which is a medical device manufacturer certification. So we're ISO certified, and then we provide logistics around all of that. So distribution, other assets that need to be added and shipped. For example, if you're trying to deploy a laptop, there may be a laptop case, there might be monitors, all other peripherals and accessories around the actual IT asset can be easily included in that. We provide kitting services, and at the end, we provide disposal. It's e-disposal with complete compliance and records, asset tracking of disk drive destruction, from shredding to you keep your own drive. So it really, we use the word cradle to the grave, and it really is cradle to the grave deployment of an asset.
That's awesome.
So that's the bulk of what we do. We are a VAR for over 500 different IT providers, including all the major ones. We're authorized, and we have a huge amount of certifications, but also around that we have processes in place to make sure that the IT we deploy for our customers are exact and 100% every single time. So that's dynamic.
That's dynamic. And you are SEWP 5. In fact, I was talking with the head of SEWP 5 the other day, or SEWP,
yes.
actually, NASA SEWP.
Yep,
and,
we're the only SEWP 5 contract holder, Group C, in Michigan.
Ah, very good. And Seaport E, as well as Schedule 70. So you have a lot of federal experience now, and providing
and
multiple agencies.
Yeah, we're also a small disadvantaged woman-owned business. So if there's a need for that, we can certainly help you check a box. But we're here because of our quality of work, and that's why we have been around for so long.
So the other person that's here is Keith Hasty with Keystone Advisors, and you're based up in Illinois, aren't you, Keith?
Yep, we're right outside of Chicago, about 10 miles suburb of Chicago. We have
good pizza up there.
Oh yeah, I tell you, around here. We are a licensed CPA firm. Even though we're headquartered in Chicago, we have programs all around the country. We work in the DC area, in Maryland, Virginia, Northern Virginia area. We have clients in Michigan and in Washington, Seattle, Washington. We have about 25 to 30 professionals right now with CPAs, CISA certified, CISM certified audit specialists. We do things like third-party SSA 16, which is now SSA 18 reporting. We have a top secret facility clearance. We are a woman-owned business, and we hold GSA PSS schedules, which include the 520, all the 520 MOBIS, and the 874 schedules. We're Seaport E holder, and we're HubZone certified also too.
Which is unique, right, for professional services provider to have HubZone certification, which is great. And that's because you are in a sister kind of environment. You also do manufacturing on the DoD side, right?
Yeah, one of our sister companies is a manufacturing company that does work for the Air Force. And we manufacture parts that go on to F-15s and C-130s and those type of military aircraft. So because our corporate headquarters and our manufacturing headquarters are located in the HubZone area, and they represent more than 35% of our workforce, we were able to get HubZone certified.
And you might be thinking, why is there a CPA firm here talking about hardware as a service? Because most agencies are not tracking assets the way they should, are they, Keith?
That's correct.
Yeah.
The new requirement from FISMA, which is the Federal Information Security Management Act, requires that the agencies have a method of asset discovery. And that's been a problem for a lot of agencies, and hardware as a service provides that type of service for those agencies.
That's exactly right. So, and we will be talking about the current situation where you have legacy equipment. Everybody knows this, right? You have legacy equipment out there. A lot of the stuff is out of spec. It creates a problem with asset management. And if you don't think there's a problem with asset management with your agency, all you have to do is ask your CFO, and he will tell you so. And most of the CIOs know it too. They don't know where everything is, which creates cyber concerns. It also creates licensing issues. In fact, creates a situation where licensings are being paid for that aren't being used. And it affects the acquisition process and being able to get new equipment for refreshing, which is tied to budget issues. And now we have a new administration, which has had an impact of being able to have the funds made available, right? We've had budgeting issues that are a result of this, and we're just starting to we're seeing a lot of flow now in the federal space, obviously. So we have several different technology issues that affect our ability to do our refresh. We have an issue that GAO released dealing with addressing legacy systems, and that could be legacy systems right to your desktop as well. There's FITARA scorecard for different for measuring the agency's ability to be compliant with their own initiatives. And then we have executive orders with improving the acquisition and management of technology, laptops and desktops that came out, which was M1602. And then we have coding government waste, which is also applying to some of the legacy systems, the licensings that are there that are not being used. So all of this kind of dovetails into what we're looking at with hardware as a service. And I was with Dave Powner this was a couple months ago now, but I was with him, and he talked about, he said, I don't think the government should be in the business of owning any IT assets. And with that, he was talking about exactly how to get hardware as a service as a methodology for the federal space, and that's what we're talking about here. So what is HaaS? Let's talk about what that is and how that applies to lifecycle management. Adnan, can you give us an overview of what hardware as a service is, so we understand kind of what the methodology is, as opposed to purchasing it outright? So what does that mean? What is hardware as a service?
Hardware as a service is defined by an agency or a company not owning the asset and completely leasing. It can be through a lease. There could be a capital lease program. There's other ways. Obviously, Keith would know a lot about this. But there's different ways of procuring it. And where the service provider, namely us, would bundle our services on a monthly basis in with the lease. So at the end of the lease, there would be a turn-in for that IT asset. But beyond that, you would have a heads up before the lease expires on what the latest replacement is or new technology is. So you can always be rolling the latest technology into your environment, and you can do it ahead of time. The object is not to wait till the end of the lease to say, oh my, gee, I'm, got a week left and I've got to think about a new system. What we do as part of our services, not only do we do the complete lifecycle management of that device, but we actually manage the lifecycle of the next device coming up for you. So, there's no downtime, there's no security gaps, there's no gaps in use at all for that IT device.
We find that one of the things that's really great about this, and you mentioned it, Adnan, is that it automatically puts you into a refresh cycle that matches the equipment and the warranties of those equipment, the equipment that you have. And you mentioned this as well, is that it's a service that's applied to that so that the agencies are no longer worried about that particular piece. And let's talk about each piece of this. So first we have the acquisition of a particular part. So it's all the same kind of methodology to be able to define what that is. And we also know, because of what GAO is doing, to tell us what are the requirements so we can standardize most of our equipment nowadays, right? So the acquisition process is going to be streamlined from that to be able to identify those. So take us through the acquisition process. If somebody wants to buy this, or somebody wants to do hardware as a service, how does it look from their perspective in identifying the equipment?
So you can always be assured that anything that we acquire on behalf of the agency would be always through authorized channels. So they're OEM authorized. There's all TA compliance, anything that's needed would be, made sure that that's disclosed up front. And what it really does by, through the acquisition process is we take that process on here internally, so the agency doesn't actually have to. So as long as we can streamline that ahead of time and kind of pave the way at the beginning, we take care of all the background acquisition. It can be, all the setting up of the leases on behalf of the agency, anything that's pre-agreed to. So, some of our customers literally go into a portal, or they go and they just order it through our internal portal, and we take care of the acquisition. We bring it into our facility in Michigan. We will make sure it's completely up to spec. So if you order 8 gig of RAM, you get 8 gig of RAM, and we authorize that it is what they say it is, and then the services are applied to it.
And you mentioned technical services applied to that as the next piece in this chain, and that includes imaging, testing, making sure that everything works the way it's supposed to, and that goes down to the user level at each individual agency that's defined and worked out with the IT staff from the agency, and putting these pieces together for them so that when it lands, there's no DOAs anymore, because it's already tested, it's running, and it's already ready to go, almost to the point of just plug and play, right?
Yeah, and depending on the agency that we can take, we have a cage internally here where we can do VPN. We have agreements with other agencies where we're authorized to go into certain parts of their Active Directory and load load user login information.
Mm-hmm.
So when it does arrive on their desktop, they can log into the network and just change their password, or we can take it as far as they want it. So it goes only, say, 80%, and then when it gets to their environment, they can plug it in and then join it to the network. So we can do both. We have a government customer. We take it all the way in a secure cage, and there's background checks done to make sure that we can, the people that are working on this are authorized to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's, like Dave said, it's part of that is the spec confirmation. We just kind of mentioned it, but it's also the software spec, and it's making sure the right image is on the right machine, because we know that customers can have multiple images, multiple pieces of software that are on add-on software that's not part of an image, but might be, finance might have a certain piece of software that's different than, manufacturing or other, parts of an agency or distribution or something. So either way, no matter what the specific add-on is, we can do it here and do it for that specific laptop or desktop at any time.
Once it gets imaged, it gets delivered, it's also going through the process of being cataloged so that it can be tracked all the way through the process, which gets us to audit proofing, and why Keith is here, because Keith knows what it's like to have to find assets that aren't tracked properly, don't you, Keith?
Yes, that's a key element in any financial audit, especially if you have a significant amount of assets that you have been maintaining. It becomes a lot easier for the auditor if you have a system of being able to track your assets, to know where they're located at, to know what's on them, to know what you're paid for in the way of software. It will help to lessen the audit time because the auditors will not have to spend as much time doing as many checks of your procurement. They can rely upon the system that comes from a vendor that is able to have the hardware as a service. That system gives them some reliance that they don't have to go beyond the normal audit steps that they would go.
And just from the Q-wrx side, what makes it so interesting is that you can do that anytime because it's real-time tracking of your assets. So you have access to that for your audit. How important is that type of access as we look into the future for being able to verify? You mentioned this earlier with FSMA with the security components. How important is that for security components?
Yeah, the FSMA, Federal Information Security Management Act, requires all federal agencies and those companies doing business with the federal government to have a system of asset discovery. You have to have a process that allows you to be able to identify how many assets you have, where they're located at, what security is on those assets. I think that this process will help to meet those requirements of that FSMA requirement and help agencies become more compliant with that FSMA requirement. And
that's exactly the reason why it's happening, and they're looking at this as a hardware as a service, as a way to be able to solve those. Logistically, what happens is you want your hardware as a service vendor to handle all the logistical components, be able to kit everything together the way it's supposed to be. You mentioned this earlier, Adnan, being able to kit those, label those, so that they're ready to go by the time they arrive. And it's then once you get to the place where it's ending its life cycle, that's when you get into, all right, you already should be in the pre-planning stages for the end of that life cycle, months ahead of the time before that the end of life actually arrives. And that gives you the ability to know, to test all the new equipment and make sure that it is like for like and it meets the OMB standards. And then finally, once you're done with that, with the old asset, there are disposal requirements for your agency, depending on the agency that you're from. You have disposal requirements, and it may be removing the hard drive or something like that. Tell us about the disposal of things like a hard drive. If we're responsible for the hard drive in dealing it through Q-wrx as the hardware as a service model, how does that work, Adnan?
Yeah, so we adhere to a whole bunch of different ways to dispose of not only the hard drive, which is important for everybody knows security reasons, but also the chassis. So and part of that is to make sure that you know, a government leased or any property that's disposed of is, you know, if it's leased, it goes back to the leaseor, and we can make sure that their disposal practices are in line with the agencies. If it's legacy equipment that comes back out of the field, we can make sure that those chassis do not appear anywhere again. They're destroyed, they're shredded, actually. We have on-site destruction of drives that we certify here. We do drive wiping first. We do mil-spec drive wiping, and then we'll actually punch the drive or shred it as needed, depending on, you know, what the requirement is. So there's a lot of ways to do green secure destruction, green recycling, and then verifying the disposal, which is extremely, obviously, very important. So we can take it as far as we want. We have agencies that hold on to equipment onto hard drives and just send chassis back. So it just depends, again, on your requirement. But we can do any or all of it. It's all in complete compliance.
And that's a big part, is being compliant with whatever the agency has, and we can build that. So some of the benefits of Q-wrx HaaS is it's deployment ready IT, which means it gets to the desktop, it is ready to go. Rapid delivery, turnaround on these, and this one of the biggest issues with agencies is the turnaround for the acquisition if you have to buy a piece of equipment and then assemble the pieces together, because a lot of times it's LPTA, and then you're pulling pieces together, and then your IT staff is actually responsible for delivering that to the desktop. And this is deployment ready, ready to go. No more dead on arrival. It's 100% compliant with all patches up to date when it is released. We manage the models of which models are actually supposed to be included to meet the OMB standards, up-to-date images, and then that also includes the increased security from the beginning. As we know, there's a lot of patchwork that is not in place, right, Keith? We have issues with patches being deployed appropriately, even as they're released, as being an issue with security, don't we? We have that as a problem too.
That is an issue, and you know, IT departments spend an inordinate amount of time going through checking all these individual assets to make sure that they are security compliant. You know, this service offers takes the burden off of them having to do that.
That's exactly right. And you can see it. It's audit ready and audit proof. And Keith, you mentioned how important that is when you're doing your financial audits, and you always have IT people that have to throw the stuff over the fence to finance, and being able to do that in a complete fashion is a great headache saver, right? It's like aspirin. So and this is one of the key pieces that you'll find, and one of the reasons why Dave Pounder's talking about this so much is it's operational versus capital expenditure. So it changes how you treat the asset, because it's not being owned by the federal government, and it can be supported by return on investment contracts. And if you're not familiar with those, that is terminology that's being incorporated in to say, hey, is this really going to save us money over the long haul? And so what we've been doing is we've been socializing this with several different CIOs and procurement folks within different agencies. It's a pilot program to see how it will work in dealing with, you know, a minimal amount of hardware to see how the hardware as a service works. And you identify a group for hardware replacement. You probably already know who that's going to be, because you have either new folks coming on, or you have equipment that's being phased out. So we look at the pilot scope of work, and we create that. We help to develop that with you so that you know what the deliverables need to be in your model. Then we do a pilot review, and then we talk about what that looks like in expanding ultimately into the program, and then program adoption. You will find that one of the key areas that you want to focus is you want to be hardware neutral. Having one of the largest ones, some of the biggest challenges we've seen is coming across folks that have tried this before, but driven from a particular vendor or particular hardware provider, because their job is to sell their hardware, and they want to do it on a lease or whatever it happens to be, but it's not what the agency actually needs. And then they wind up in trouble when they have to make changes. So what we do is the Q-wrx platform rides over top of whatever the hardware needs to be. It doesn't have to come from Dell, or it doesn't have to come from HP. It can be a combination of those, or it can be different providers. So with that, I want to throw this out. I think my agency, and we have several agencies that are here today, my agency would be interested in a Q-wrx pilot. It's not a complicated tool. It winds up being very beneficial to folks as they look at the potential for hardware as a service, and it may be something that's beneficial for you, and we can help build that pilot. And we can even build in a sample for you with an unsolicited proposal. We're doing that on multiple agencies right now, which is kind of cool. So with that, we'll close that out, and we have some folks that say they are, and some folks that they're not sure yet, but that's great, because we appreciate you being here. And with that, we want to get to some questions, because we know that we're running a little bit right towards the edge, so we'll get some of those questions. One of the questions is, Will this presentation be made available? Yes, it will. It will be made available as a PowerPoint presentation as well as a video link so that you can watch this over and over and over again because we know it's so great. But that's one of those things. And there's another question about what are the complications or what are some of the things that are in the way of hardware as a service. And we see that in contracting because of the way that your contracts are oriented right now, which is why the pilot is a great idea to be able to take you from a purchase mentality and ownership mentality to find out how it would work within your agency. And that way it's not following the classic acquisition management that you're doing right now. And that's one of the key areas of where you will find some challenges with your current acquisition process. And that's why the pilot is a great idea to say, hey, then you can move that upstream or get your management buy-in for those. And if you have any other questions, you can shoot it to us. You can raise your hand as well if anybody would like to chime in. And otherwise, we're going to move on and get you finished up here so that you can get on with your day, and you can always submit those questions. So, staying out of hot water, use the pilot or proof of concept model to be able to determine if it's good for your agency. And some of the things that you would want to look for in a hardware as a service pilot is make sure that they have a facilities clearance so they can keep things separated. And if you require that, even if you don't, it's a great thing to know that that they have facilities of clearance, and both DCC as well as Keystone both have facilities clearance. So we understand exactly how that works. The other part is dealing with ISO or ISO certification. If you're not familiar with that, ISO 9001 platform is an operational process management to make sure that the companies, your vendors, a lot of these are being showing up in contracts as well, that you have the ability to look at the processes and know that they have gone through the ISO process development. It's a way of being able to process out every single component that comes through and know that it is handled appropriately. And let's talk about this real quick, Keith, with SSAE 16. What is that again?
It's a requirement that any provider, third-party provider, such as hardware as a service, goes through and have their processes reviewed to ensure that their internal control processes are adequate to be able to give good data to people who are relying upon that report. So they want to make sure, for example, when your hardware as a service provider says that these assets exist and here's where they're located at, and here is the amount of assets that they have, the auditor can rely upon their processes that they're giving adequate information to their customer, that the third party is giving adequate information. So all third-party vendors should have a SSAE 16, which is an assurance, some assurance that the data that they're getting from the third party is accurate and can be relied upon.
And that is critically important, especially as you move into this model. And the other part that's important is, if you think about it, you have a lot of government-owned equipment right now. Is there a way to bridge the gap between owning the equipment and HaaS, and how does that ramp look? Because the way that we look at it is say, is there a way to be able to manage the equipment that's already in place so that you can get to a place where your auditors aren't driving you nuts because you don't have the information that they need. So look for vendors that have the capacity to bridge from government-owned to a hardware as a service, and make sure you can set the inventory requirements and that those inventory requirements are actually there and can be maintained, because when you have turnover, when you have equipment that goes bad, you want to make sure that other equipment can get there. Make sure that you have the build to spec options for your agency, because the 80-20 rule does apply here, where most of the stuff that OMB is talking about for standardizing is the 80%. But what about the 20% that's unique to your agency? So make sure that they have the ability to incorporate that into your into your process as well, with tablets and all the rest of the things that make life work. Right? So verify the past performance, measure the return on investments. If you're going to do that and say, hey, it's going to cost X amount of dollars, let's talk about what the return on investment is. Did you know that you could actually build a return on investment? Because, for instance, maybe it takes you 3 weeks to be able to do a procurement for a new hire. Well, what happens if you could do that within a day and then it lands on their desk ready to roll? That makes a big difference. And in fact, we can incorporate the entire cost, oftentimes, of your entire contract into that if it takes 3 weeks to hire, 3 or 4 weeks from time to hire to the time where you have equipment sitting on the desk. And finally, establish and use BPAs, especially now. Especially now. If you're not using BPAs, you can get those ready to work so that it's less paperwork and it's fast turn for fiscal year end. Always a good tool to have in your contracting box. If you need some help with that, we can do that as well. And with that, you will get from this follow-up, you get the presentation, like I mentioned, you'll have the Q&A that we've talked about, and that we have some other additional questions potentially that will be included, and the supporting documentation that we had for the executive orders. I'll also include some of that I mentioned with OMB because of what we're seeing coming down the pipe from OMB and their standards. A white paper that we've talked about and have been socializing with the CIO Council, and procurement options, as well as additional documentation. And with that, we're going to let everybody get out of here on time today, believe it or not. So I don't know if Adnan's still there to be able to say goodbye, because I know that he had to jump on a meeting that popped up today. But I know Keith is here to be able to say goodbye to everybody and wish everybody well the rest of this summer. So go ahead, Keith. We'll let you go first.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate you listening to our presentation. And as Dave said, I hope you have a great summer.
Yeah, and we really do. We know that it's getting crazy with fiscal year end coming. A lot of folks that I've talked to are already in the throes of it. So a lot of things happening. So we appreciate you taking the time today to join us. And on behalf of Adnan and Keith, we really do appreciate you being here, and enjoy your summer. Thanks much.